Hey there. Tonight, we are following a clay record into a silence so old it almost feels like weather. In a cold museum vault in Oxford, a prism the size of a human forearm waits in the dark, and pressed into its four narrow faces is a sentence that still feels a little dangerous to read slowly. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu, not born there, not invented there, not fought into existence by some muddy local tyrant with a loud voice and a sharp stick, descended there, as if rule itself arrived from somewhere beyond the first city and was handed down like cargo. And once that sentence appears, everything around it becomes stranger. There are impossible reigns measured in numbers that swell like tides. There are 5 cities before the flood, 8 kings before history settles into anything familiar, and behind them all there is the old Sumerian claim that the Anunnaki did not merely inspire order. They administered it. If that is the kind of quiet trouble you like to fall asleep to, then give the video a like. Subscribe as well, and come a little deeper with me, because this one only grows stranger the longer you sit beside it. Let the room soften. Let the jaw unclench just a little. Just settle. The fire is low. The night is patient, and the clay has been waiting longer than either of us. I have always found it strange that the most unnerving things in history are often the smallest. A broken seal, a bent nail, a name in the margin of a ledger, and here, a prism of fired clay sitting in archival darkness, carrying a statement so calm it almost feels polite. The Weld Blundell prism does not shout. It does not dramatize itself. It just rests there and says, in effect, rule came down from heaven. And then it starts listing names, as if this were the most normal clerical business in the world. Picture it for a moment. A drawer sliding open under controlled light. Air cool enough to keep old clay stable. The soft hush that museums have when nobody is trying to impress anyone. Then, the object itself, narrow, brown, slightly uneven, still bearing the pressure of a scribe's careful hand. If you were standing there with me, I think the first surprise would be how ordinary it looks. Not glamorous, not mystical, just clay. Dust-colored. Quiet. Then the second surprise would arrive. The one that matters. Objects that ordinary should not be able to carry ideas this large. The prism records what scholars call the Sumerian King List. That sounds tidy, maybe even dry. It should sound dry. Dry things can be trusted. Lists feel responsible. Lists wear spectacles and keep receipts. But the moment the text begins, dry turns uncanny. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Aridu. That is not how modern civilizations talk about themselves. We say states emerge. Institutions develop. Power centralizes. Administration evolves. The prism offers no such comfort. It speaks like someone recording a transfer. And then come the kings. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi the shepherd. The names move down the prism like beads on an old string, and each is paired with a reign so long it breaks the back of modern patience. 28,000 800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Mainstream scholarship, quite understandably, tells us these numbers are symbolic. Dynastic totals, sacred mathematics, mythic magnification, literary theology. Some scholars argue that is the safest reading, and perhaps it is. We cannot be sure. But safety is not the same as satisfaction. The old scribes were not throwing numbers around like confetti at a wedding. The pattern is too careful for that. The increments are regular. The structure is deliberate. It feels less like fantasy improvising, and more like an archive preserving something it does not dare simplify. That is where the whole story begins to lean. Because once you accept that the numbers were chosen carefully, even if they are not literal in our plain modern sense, another question rises beside them. What exactly did the scribes think they were preserving? Theology, memory, administrative tradition, a damaged record from a world older than the floodline they themselves kept copying because it still mattered. The prism divides time into before the flood and after the flood. That alone is worth lingering over. Not before myth and after myth. Not before legend and after reality. Before the flood, then after the flood. As if a civilizational reset had taken place, and the scribes were keeping account across the break. Before the waters swept over, there were 5 cities. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. Again, that word is a quiet knife. Again means there had already been a system. Again means it was interrupted. Again means someone, somewhere, thought it needed to be reestablished. If this were only a myth, it is a very administrative myth. Honestly, that may be one of the most charming and unsettling things about Sumer. Even its cosmic mysteries sound as if they were copied by a very serious clerk who would have preferred everyone keep their elbows off the table. You can feel that clerkly temperament everywhere. The text summarizes. It totals. It names cities in order. It closes sections with the rhythm of record keeping. These are 5 cities. 8 kings ruled them. Then the flood swept over. That is the cadence of an archive, not a bard losing himself in decorative ecstasy. The language has edges. It files things. And behind the list stands the larger claim that makes the whole thing breathe a little colder. The Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth, are not described in these old traditions as distant abstractions floating above human life like a painted ceiling. They govern. They allocate. They move between domains. They oversee cities. They decide. They transfer authority. They appear less like symbols and more like officials in a system so old the surviving humans could only preserve it in the language of divinity. That is the focus point of the story, and it has to be held from the beginning like a candle that does not waver. Earth in these texts does not feel like the only stage. It feels like one managed territory in a larger arrangement. One domain, one station, one settled place inside a wider hierarchy of realms, jurisdictions, and roots. The title pulls the listener toward that thought, but the hook has to do something softer. It has to let the feeling unfold. A clay record. A kingship that descends. The sense that the first cities of humanity were not founding themselves in splendid isolation, but receiving a system from beyond their own beginning. There is something deeply sleepy about this kind of dread. I think, not panic, not horror, just scale. Deep time has a way of quieting the room. The more ancient the claim, the smaller your own worries become, at least for a while. A late bill, an awkward message, the slightly embarrassing thing you said 3 years ago. All of it starts to shrink when you are sitting beside a prism that calmly insists civilization may have been imported. So let us go slowly into Eridu. Imagine the southern edge of ancient Mesopotamia when the world was more water than road. Marshlight. Reed bats. Mul ona sandals. The Tigris and Euphrates spilling their complicated gifts across the land. Aridu rising not as a grand empire but as an early sacred center, a place the Sumerians remembered as first. First city, first seat of kingship, first settled point after authority came down. You can almost hear the damp hush of it. Birds moving over shallow water. Workers in reed boats. Clay walls taking the sun. A temple mound beginning to organize human attention around itself. If you were standing there at dawn, you would not know you were standing at the beginning of written history. Nobody ever does. They are too busy carrying jars, checking animals, worrying about grain, trying not to fall in the mud. Yet later, generations looked back at Aridu and said, "This is where the order arrived." That is a very different claim from saying, "This is where we slowly invented everything ourselves." The script I am following tonight insists that we take that difference seriously, not recklessly, not with the eager gullibility of someone who believes every dramatic thing because it is dramatic, but seriously enough to stop flattening these records into comforting myth before they have finished speaking. The old texts do not only tell stories about gods. They keep describing domains, transfers, roots, decisions, jurisdictions. They name authorities as though those authorities had recognizable roles. Anu above. Enlil managing Earth. Enki governing the Abzu. Inanna moving between power centers with an almost political intensity. The underworld not as a vague spiritual punishment, but as a ruled territory with gates and judges. Distant mountain cities with resources and tribute obligations. The more one listens, the less this sounds like loose, symbolic fog, and the more it starts to resemble memory. Formalized, embellished, perhaps, but memory of a system. That does not prove the boldest interpretation. It does not prove that Earth was literally one of many Anunnaki colonies, in the way a modern science fiction reader might instantly imagine. But it does make the question feel earned. And that matters. A good sleep story does not bludgeon the listener with declarations. It lets the question earn its weight. Then it places that weight gently across the chest and leaves it there like a warm blanket that is perhaps a touch too heavy. The numbers keep working on me. I have to admit, 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. Not random. Never random. There is an old mathematical mood to them, something measured, something almost procedural. They are excessive, yes, but excessive with discipline, like ceremonial architecture that is too symmetrical to dismiss as madness. The same civilization that later gave the world such refined administrative habit did not suddenly become sloppy when talking about its deepest past. Some listeners will already be thinking, all right, but numbers in ancient texts are often symbolic. And yes, they are. They can encode prestige, siklu, sacred proportion, dynastic memory. We can allow all of that. Still, the more interesting question remains untouched by that concession. Why did later scribes keep copying these impossible figures with such care? Why preserve what looked absurd even to them, unless they believed the absurdity belonged to an older record too important to erase? A copyist by lamplight. That image returns to me again and again. His fingers marked with clay dust. His back bent slightly. The room warm, but the night outside cooler now. Perhaps a faint smell of oil smoke. Perhaps somebody coughing in another chamber. He copies names and reign lengths from a source older than his own city walls. He does not correct them into sensible numbers. He does not tidy heaven into metaphor. He preserves. That may be the most human thing in the whole story. A person who does not understand everything deciding that loss would be worse than confusion. And in that act of preservation, something survives long enough to trouble us. By the end of this opening movement, the prism should feel like more than an artifact. It should feel like a sealed doorway, not yet opened wide, just unlatched. On one side is the modern world with its categories: myth, history, religion, administration. On the other is the Sumerian archive, where those categories blur under older pressure. There, kingship can descend. Flood can reset the world, and Earth can begin to look less like the whole field of human meaning and more like one governed district inside a wider order whose outlines are only just starting to show through the clay. Stay there for a breath longer. Let the dark of the museum return. Let the prism rest once more in its vault. Let the old first line echo and settle. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. We have heard it now. Let the prism rest once more in its vault. And once that sentence is heard, the next thing we need is not more wonder, but a key. We need to know how the wedges were read at all, how cuneiform came back to life, and why the recovered texts sound so much less like fantasy than we were taught to expect. If the first part of the mystery belongs to the prism itself, the next part belongs to the long, patient art of making dead writing speak again. Because one of the easiest ways to keep an ancient record safely distant is to imagine it as unreadable. A blur of wedges, a decorative field of little marks, strange enough to admire, obscure enough to ignore. But cuneiform does not grant us that excuse. It was broken open. It was studied. It was argued over by scholars who spent decades comparing signs, languages, contexts, and archives. The words came back. And when the words came back, they did not sound nearly as vague as modern people might have preferred. The recovery begins far from Sumer itself, on a cliff in Persia, where the Behistun inscription waited high above a desert road. I love that setting. Wind against stone, heat shimmering upward, a royal proclamation nailed to the living face of a mountain. It feels less like scholarship and more like trespass against time. Henry Rawlinson copied it at serious risk, hanging where most people would have preferred to stay very much alive on the ground. Through the trilingual inscription, Old Persian opened a door, then Babylonian, then the deeper and stranger chamber behind them, Sumerian. The process was not elegant. It never is. There were misreadings, correction, rivalries, patient breakthroughs, decades of accumulated labor. Signs could carry sound, object, idea, divine name, geographical marker, depending on context. A single wedge cluster might mean heaven, God, the sky deity An, or simply the syllabic value tied to that old word. Reading cuneiform meant reading layers, reading time itself in stacked linguistic sediment. If you were in one of those early museum rooms in the 19th century, the atmosphere would be very different from the ancient temple, and yet oddly similar in one respect. Silence, concentration, lamps, paper, dust, men leaning over copies and squeezes, comparing marks the way ancient scribes once compared authoritative tablets. A new priesthood of translation, though they would have hated the comparison. And what did they find when the language opened? Not a swarm of disconnected local legends, not a cheerful confusion of contradictory divine gossip, but a world with unnerving consistency. Names repeated across cities and centuries. Anu, high above. Enlil, over earth. Enki in the Apsu. Inanna, moving with dangerous independence. Councils, decisions, transfers, roots, jurisdictions. The deeper scholars went into the corpus. The more they encountered an archive that behaved less like drifting folklore and more like a civilization preserving a coherent operating memory. That is where the mood of the story changes. Once the wedges are readable, the mystery is no longer whether the ancients were saying anything at all. The mystery becomes what category of saying this was. Some texts are easy enough to place. Receipts, grain tallies, labor assignments, temple distribution, contracts, school exercises. You look at them and the ancient world becomes almost embarrassingly familiar. Somebody owes somebody barley. Somebody is annoyed by missing goods. Somebody is keeping account because somebody else absolutely cannot be trusted without written proof. Human beings, delightfully consistent across millennia. But beside those practical texts are the narratives, the hymns, the epics, the king lists, the flood stories, the descent stories, the creation accounts. And here is the problem. They are preserved in the same clay habit, the same archival instinct, the same scribal seriousness. They were copied not as disposable entertainment, but as things worth keeping safe. That alone should slow us down. Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobsen, George Smith, and the generations around them each noticed in different ways that these texts, often read with a procedural clarity that does not sit easily inside the cozy word myth. Myth can be grand, certainly. Myth can be precise in ritual sequence, but Sumerian narrative often feels administrative in its bones. That is the thing that lingers. It likes order too much. It files. It totals. It names officials. It tracks transfer of authority. It summarizes domains. It keeps sounding as if someone wants the record to remain usable. Take the stories of the Anunnaki. In modern shorthand, they get flattened into gods. And that is not wrong as translation goes. But translation can be a padded chair. It lets us sit comfortably too soon. The Anunnaki in these texts are collective authorities, sometimes acting as individuals, sometimes as assembly, sometimes as judges, sometimes as governors of specific zones. They are tied to heaven and earth through directional language, through movement, through appointment, through administration. Those who came from heaven to earth is a phrase that is easy to romanticize and equally easy to dismiss. What the texts make harder to dismiss is the repeated sense that these beings operated within a structured hierarchy. That hierarchy is one of the strongest threads in the archive. Anu is not merely abstract sky. He is upper authority. Enlil is not just storm in a symbolist's robe. He acts like executive power over earth. Enki is not simply wisdom as a sweet idea. He governs the Apsu, holds the me, devise solution, preserves knowledge, and intervenes with the cool practicality of someone who understands systems better than the rest of the room. Inanna is not just love and war as decorative opposites. She moves between centers of power, secures authority, claims jurisdiction, and pushes at boundaries as if testing the limits of a political map. You know that feeling when a family story stops sounding like a fable and starts sounding like a dispute over inheritance? That is what happens here. The divine world sounds political, territorial, managed. The source transcript wants the listener to notice this very early. It is not enough to say ancient people personified natural forces. These texts behave too consistently for that explanation to satisfy by itself. The relationships remain stable. The lines of authority remain recognizable. The domains remain distinct. Even when details vary, the structure underneath holds. And that structure becomes especially sharp in the so-called creation accounts. We are used to creation myths being lofty. Light from darkness, sea from land, man from dust, breath from divinity, the Sumerian and Akkadian materials, by contrast, can be startlingly practical. In Atrahasis, the gods are tired of labor. They have been digging canals, doing the heavy work of ordering the land, and they are no longer willing to carry the burden themselves. There is complaint. There is assembly. There is deliberation. There is a solution. Create a workforce. That is not my modern paraphrase trying to be clever. That is the administrative mood of the text itself. Honestly, there is almost something wickedly funny in that. Humanity enters not under a trumpet of sacred destiny, but under a labor memo. Yet the humor only makes the darkness gentler. It does not remove it. The idea is severe. Humans are made to serve the system, to take over the burden. Clay mixed with divine substance. A workforce fashioned to bear what the Anunnaki no longer wish to bear. If read symbolically, it explains toil. If read historically, it implies design. If read somewhere in between, it suggests a memory of social order so old it had already become sacred by the time it reached the scribes. The flood narratives deepen that same feeling. Again, not spontaneous wrath in the dramatic later style, but population management discussed in council. Humanity too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. Measures considered. A final solution chosen. Enki dissenting. A survivor warned. Knowledge preserved. The afterimage is not simply religious terror. It is policy. That is what makes the whole archive feel less like decorative mythology and more like a body of records wearing the garments of myth, because that was the idiom available to the people copying them. There is a lovely oddity in the way modern scholarship sometimes handles this. The numbers are accepted when they behave scientifically. The astronomy can be praised. The lexical sophistication can be praised. The writing system can be admired. The administrative complexity can be admired. But the moment the same archives insist that authority descended from heaven, that knowledge was transmitted, that councils of higher beings managed multiple domains, many readers suddenly become squeamish and reach for the word symbolic as if it were a handkerchief. Perhaps it is symbolic. Sometimes it surely is. But symbols tend to blur. These texts keep sharpening. If you were sitting in a scribe school in ancient Nippur, the room would smell of damp clay, old reed, and human effort. Boys or young men murmuring signs aloud. A teacher correcting the angle of impressions. Tablets stacked in varying states of drying. The work repetitive, technical, reverent in its own stern way. Some tablets would teach grammar. Some would teach numbers. Some would preserve hymns. Some would preserve older records whose authority came from age, not from charm. That educational world matters because it tells us how Mesopotamia regarded its own archive. Not as quaint story collection, but as inheritance. This is why the phrase architecture of translation feels right for the second movement of the story. We are not merely translating words. We are trying to decide what kind of building those words belong to. Temple, court, ledger house, observatory, mythic theater, government archive. The frustrating and beautiful answer is that in Sumer, these structures are not cleanly separate. The temple is an archive. The archive is an administrative center. The administrative center speaks in sacred language. The sacred language contains technical information. The technical information is preserved with liturgical seriousness. Everything leans into everything else. That fusion is the listener's true challenge. We have to resist forcing the old world into our cleaner shelves. Num preveldis, the Sumerians did not write as though religion and administration were enemies, or as though symbolism and logistics must never share a room. A city could be sacred and economically managed. A god could rule a domain and embody a principle. A descent from heaven could be theological and territorial at the same time. That is why the archive feels denser than later myths. It carries more weight per line. By the end of this second movement, what I want the listener to feel is not certainty, but permission. Permission to stop underestimating the texts. Permission to let them sound stranger and more concrete than polite modern summaries often allow. Permission to hear that when the cuneiform finally opened, the result was not a pretty haze of primitive superstition, but a sustained record of councils, domain, transfers, flood boundaries, labor burdens, and distributed authority. The prism in Oxford, said kingship, descended from heaven. Translation now tells us that sentence belongs to a much larger environment, one where the Anunnaki are repeatedly treated as organized powers in a structured system. That does not prove the boldest theory yet, but it removes the lazy refuge of saying the old records are too vague to matter. They matter because they are specific. The room should feel slightly different now. The fire lower, the night deeper, the archive wider. We have moved from the object to the language, and the language has done what good old evidence always does. It has made the easy dismissal harder. The next thing we need, naturally, is to follow that recovered language into the stories that sound least like stories. The councils, the creation of the workforce called humanity, and the unsettling possibility that what we call myth may sometimes be records wearing the only clothing that survived. The strangest thing about the old Mesopotamian stories is not that they contain gods. Nearly every ancient culture did that. The strangest thing is how often the gods behave like administrators under pressure. Once the language is recovered and the names begin settling into their places, the great old narratives stop feeling like loose dream material and start sounding unnervingly procedural. Someone complains. Someone convenes the assembly. Someone carries authority over one domain but not another. Someone argues for one solution. Someone argues for another. And then a decision is made that affects the world below. That mood appears with particular force in the stories surrounding the Anunnaki assembly. The source transcript leans hard into this, and honestly, it is one of the strongest parts of the whole case. In later retellings, people often blur everything together and speak as if Sumerian myth were only a shimmering cloud of symbols. But the surviving texts keep forcing us back toward structure. The beings at the top of the system do not simply radiate power. They deliberate. They assign. They manage burdens. They regulate populations. They divide labor. They sit in council. If you imagine a scene from one of these narratives in the ordinary theatrical way, you might picture thunder, gold, fire, and dramatic robes. The texts themselves often feel cooler than that. There is dignity, yes, but there is also procedure. One can almost hear the scrape of chairs in a chamber that is too old for chairs. The pause before one figure speaks. The weary irritation of another. The awful calm of a decision that sounds as if it has already been written down somewhere else. The Atrahasis material is perhaps the clearest example. Before humanity exists, the lesser gods labor. They dig canals, move earth, maintain the work that makes the world habitable and productive. It is such an oddly physical beginning for a cosmic story. not a hymn to pure transcendence, but a labor problem. The lower tier of divine beings grows tired. They complain. They revolt. They march. They come to the house of Enlil. Right there, the whole emotional temperature changes. We are no longer in a landscape of vague, holy symbolism. We are in the middle of a crisis meeting. I have always found that darkly funny in the best way. The universe, or at least this corner of it, does not begin with an abstract, philosophical pronouncement. It begins with overworked personnel and an exhausted management structure. That makes the world of the text feel less childish, not more. Systems strain. Labor produces resentment. Authority gathers in council when burden becomes unstable. Ancien or moderne. That pattern is painfully recognizable. Then comes the solution. Humanity. Not as the beloved crowning flower of creation, not first of all, but as replacement labor. Clay is mixed with divine material. A being is fashioned that can bear the toil the gods no longer wish to bear. There is something cold about that, and the script is right to keep it cold. This is not a sentimental origin. It is a functional one. Humans are built for service within an existing order. If the boldest reading of the archive is true, then this is not simply mythology. It is memory of hierarchy, compressed into sacred narrative. Some scholars would immediately resist that, and fairly so. They would say this is an etiological story, a way to explain why life feels like work, why irrigation, agriculture, and temple service define civilization. There is truth in that reading. But again, the more the story speaks, the less it wants to stay small. The labor revolt, the assembly, the solution by design, the repeated jurisdictional logic. It all sounds oddly specific. It sounds like a civilization remembering its own place in a chain of command. The same procedural feeling appears in the flood narratives, and perhaps even more strongly there. Humanity grows numerous. Humanity becomes noisy. That word noisy is easy to underestimate. It sounds almost comic at first, as though the gods cannot sleep because humans are being rude downstairs. But the deeper one sits with it, the less childish it seems. Noise here feels like population pressure, social complexity, urban density, unmanaged growth, the friction of too many lives operating too close together inside a system built by higher powers. The response is not a tantrum. It is deliberation. Measures are tried. Plague, drought, famine. Then, finally, flood. Again, that is not how loose fantasy behaves. It is how policy behaves when lesser measures fail. Enki complicates everything in a way that makes the archive even richer. He is not a rebel in the simple sense. He does not stand outside the divine order. He works within it, around it, through its cracks. He preserves. He warns. He finds technical solutions without openly shattering the assembly that authorized the catastrophe in the first place. The image of Enki speaking to the reed wall rather than directly to the man behind it is one of the cleverest and eeriest details in all ancient literature. It feels like legal evasion inside a sacred bureaucracy. The oath is formally kept. the knowledge is practically transmitted. Civilization survives because the system contains at least one intelligence that values continuity more than rigid obedience. That concern with continuity matters. The texts are not interested only in biological survival. They preserve skills, seeds, procedures, lineages of capability. The afterworld is meant to begin again without falling all the way back into ignorance. This is one of the great repeating patterns in the archive. Knowledge must survive even when populations do not. Order can contract, but it must not collapse beyond retrieval. If you were standing with me beside the fire, I think this is where the room would go especially quiet. Because it is one thing to hear that ancient people told stories about gods and floods. It is another to hear those same stories unfold like memoranda from a world where the highest authorities were managing labor, regulating burden, and protecting institutional memory through disaster. The whole atmosphere of the texts changes when you let them keep their administrative bones. The same feeling appears in Enuma Elish, though in a more overtly cosmic register. After the violence of origin, after the struggle with Tiamat, Marduk does not merely celebrate. He organizes. He arranges the heavens. He assigns stations. He places responsibilities. He structures the upper order the way a victorious ruler structures a newly won empire. The language is not of spontaneous beauty but of ordered deployment. The stars are assigned. Time is divided. Celestial functions are distributed. If the heavens are a system, then the system must be governed. That is the logic. You know that feeling when a room that looked decorative at first suddenly reveals itself to be an office. That is what happens with these texts. The ornament falls away. The management remains. This is why the colony reading, bold as it is, keeps exerting pressure. It does not arise from a single sensational line. It arises from repeated texture, councils, labor systems, transfers of kingship, catastrophic resets, distinct jurisdictions, preservation of knowledge, resource flows, technical instruction. The archive keeps producing the same kind of world from different angles. A world in which Earth is not the whole field of action, but one managed territory inside a larger network of authority. The old phrase, kingship descended from heaven, now begins to look less like symbolic flourish and more like a perfect summary of the archive's political instinct. Rule comes from above. Not metaphorically above in a merely moral sense, but from a level of order beyond the first city. Human rulers inherit delegated authority. They do not create the institution itself. They receive it. And that, in turn, sheds new light on why Mesopotamian kings were so obsessed with legitimacy. They were not just flattering themselves by invoking gods. They were locating themselves within a framework they genuinely believed predated them. To rule well was not to improvise brilliance. It was to align with the inherited order. To fail was not just personal weakness. It was misadministration within a chain of command that reached beyond Earth. I think that is why even the great names in these stories feel slightly tired in the right way. Not exhausted exactly, but burdened. Enlil, burdened by human noise. Enki, burdened by preservation. Inanna, burdened by movement between centers of authority and desire. Anu burdened by upper sovereignty. These are not flat figures. They carry the pressure of office. Their conflicts feel like institutional conflicts because the texts imagine them that way. There is another layer to this that I think deserves to be felt slowly rather than merely stated. Ancient readers would have heard these stories in rooms where sacred authority and practical dependence were already braided together. The same hand that offered grain at a shrine might later record labor quotas. The same institution that preserved hymns also stored calculations, receipts, and legal precedent. So when a divine assembly argued over burden, productivity, or disruptive populations, the audience was not hearing nonsense from a remote fantasy land. They were hearing their own world reflected upward into a more terrible register. That mirroring matters. It means the stories did not drift above society. They interpreted society from the top down. Imagine a temple courtyard late in the evening, after the administrative day has thinned, but before the night fully cools the brick. Workers have gone. A few priests remain. Somewhere in an inner room, a tablet is being copied, while outside, the moon climbs quietly over the wall. The city breathes below, full of kitchens, repairs, minor grievances, lovers, sick children, unpaid obligations, and all the little sounds that make a settlement feel alive. Then, inside the story being copied, the higher powers call those sounds noise and begin debating reduction. That is a chilling inversion. Ordinary life becomes, from the perspective above, a management problem. I think that is why these texts soothe and disturb at the same time. They make human life feel small, which can be calming, but they also make it feel supervised, which can be eerie. One can rest beneath a larger order. One can also be trapped beneath it. Mesopotamian literature never fully resolves which feeling is the truer one. It lets both remain, and perhaps that is why the stories lasted. By the end of this movement, the listener should feel the soft dread of recognition. Not panic. Recognition. Ancient stories are becoming legible as records of management, hierarchy, and inherited order. That does not settle the matter. It deepens it. Because once the assembly begins to sound real in its structure, the next question becomes unavoidable. If all of this was remembered as pre-flood administration, what exactly were the scribes preserving when they copied the old King List, with its impossible durations and its 5 first cities before the waters came? The archive has moved us from translation into governance. And now governance is about to run headlong into deep time. The pre-flood portion of the King List has a way of sitting in the mind long after the reading is finished. It does not argue for itself. It does not explain. It simply lists 5 cities, 8 kings, immense spans of rule, then the flood swept over. The effect is almost hypnotic, like listening to a clerk quietly announce absurdities with such composure that your own disbelief begins to sound a little theatrical by comparison. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sipper, then Shuruppak. The cities arrive one by one like stations on a submerged route. You can hear the old geography in them if you let the names move slowly enough. Eridu low in the marsh country, already heavy with the memory of firstness. Bad Tibira associated later with craft and metallurgy. Sipar with the sun and legal radiance. Shirupak waiting near the floodline like a sentence not yet completed. The list gives them in order and moves on as if nothing about them were controversial. That calmness is one of the most disturbing features of the whole tradition. The scribes are not trying to persuade. They are preserving. And then the kings. Alulim at Eridu. Alalgar after him. Then at Bad Tibira, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumozi the shepherd. At Larak, Sipad Zidana. At Sipper, Anmenduana. At Shurupak, Ubara Tutu. Each paired with a reign measured not in the manageable arithmetic of ordinary dynasties, but in tens of thousands of years. 28,800, 36,000, 43,200. On and on the figures go, all stately and impossible, until total time itself begins to feel ceremonial. Mainstream scholarship has long called these figures symbolic, and that may well be right in part. Some scholars argue they compress dynasties, or encode sacred mathematics, or dramatize remoteness from ordinary history. We cannot be sure. But even if they are symbolic, the symbolism is not casual. The numbers obey the old sexagesimal mood of Mesopotamia. They are tied to the same mathematical imagination that later governs time, Angles, and celestial reckoning. This matters because it means the figures are not fantasy spilling out in random excess. They are structured excess, official excess, almost liturgical in their discipline. I have always found that more unsettling than plain impossibility. Anyone can invent nonsense. It takes a certain kind of archive to preserve nonsense with mathematical dignity. Picture a later scribe in a schoolroom or temple library, copying from an older exemplar. The room smells of dry clay and warm plaster. Outside, carts groan somewhere. Animals shift. Temple duties continue. Inside, the copyist presses each sign with the care of someone who knows he is handling material older than his city walls. He copies the impossible reign lengths without correction. He does not round them down to something sensible. He does not insert a helpful note saying these are merely symbolic. Do not worry. He preserves the record as record. That scribal fidelity is part of the evidence. Whatever he thought these figures meant, he thought they were too important to soften. That is where the pre-flood section starts to feel less like legend and more like damaged memory. Not memory in the warm personal sense, but institutional memory. The kind that survives in lists, names, roots, tenure records, and sequences even when the original context has become difficult to recover. The flood itself intensifies that feeling. The text does not wander into it poetically. It drops it almost like a ledger break. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven again. Again. That word returns and thickens the air around it. Again means continuity across disruption. again means there was a known system before the break and a restoration after the break. Again means the scribes are not framing the flood as the invention of kingship, but as an interruption in an already existing line of rule. This is one of the strongest reasons the source transcript leans on the colony interpretation. If kingship descends before the flood and descends again after the flood, then kingship is not local improvisation. It is transferred authority from outside the human field of invention. You know that feeling when you find a document marked revised and realize the version in your hand is already the second or third installation of something much older. That is what again does here. The post-flood cities are not starting civilization. They are reopening it. The figure of Enmedaranki deepens this even further. In later partitions, he becomes the king who is taken into the divine assembly, shown heavenly and earthly secrets, and taught the arts of divination and sacred reckoning. Whether he belongs neatly inside the King List sequence or stands beside it in related memory, his presence matters because he embodies the old Mesopotamian patterns so clearly. Kingship and knowledge are not self-generated. They are taught upward from the assembly above to the chosen ruler below. The ruler becomes a human node inside a larger system of transmission. And that system keeps sounding administrative rather than merely mystical. Secrets are shown. Procedures are passed down. Signs are interpreted. Authority is delegated. The whole thing is too organized to feel like casual myth-making. Even its grandeur has filing cabinets hidden inside it. If you were standing in one of those first cities before the flood, assuming the memory preserves some dim historical core beneath its magnificence, what would it feel like? Perhaps not very mythic at all. Mud brick structures under a huge sky. Reed mats drying. Kilns breathing heat. The smell of bitumen, fish, wet earth, dung smoke. Priests and officials moving in territories already assigned. Labor already classified. The nearest temple already acting as archive. Court. And communication center. Nothing in ordinary life would feel cinematic because ordinary life never does. Yet over it all there would be the firm conviction that the city sat inside an order not of its own making. That is why the impossible reigns may matter even if they are not literal durations. They create scale. Not random scale, but administrative scale. They say the pre-flood world operated on a time frame outside normal human experience. Long tenure, deep continuity, rule so extended that later post-flood kings appear almost miniature by comparison. The numbers shrink after the flood. History contracts. The air changes. Deep time gives way to human time. That shrinking is one of the recurring motifs the user asked to preserve, and it fits here perfectly. Before the flood, vast spans. After the flood, smaller reigns, denser events, a world more familiar and more fragile. The list itself feels like a narrowing funnel, moving from immense inherited order toward the cramped, measurable centuries of recorded history. Honestly, I think that narrowing is part of why the pre-flood material remains so powerful. It is not just about impossibly old kings. It is about loss. The list remembers a broader frame than the world of the copyist now inhabits. By the time the later scribes preserve it, They are already living after the great contraction. Their cities still matter. Their gods still rule. But the durations are shorter, the world more crowded, the memory of origin further away. Copying the pre-flood section becomes an act of mourning as much as record-keeping. The flood itself carries that mournful pressure. In Mesopotamian thought, it is not merely a weather event. It is the dividing wall in time, before and after. Two administrations separated by water. Two distributions of authority. The old 5 cities before. The later cities after. That is why the list refuses to abandon the flood as a real boundary, even when later readers may not know exactly what historical event or chain of events lies behind it. The boundary had become sacred because it had become structural. And structure, again, is the key. The King List is not a poem. It is an archive, wearing a ceremonial face. That does not make every detail literal in the modern narrow sense. It makes every detail intentional. The 5 cities mean something. The 8 kings mean something. The great numbers mean something. The flood break means something. And the descent of kingship from heaven, twice, perhaps means more than modern comfort likes to allow. There is also an odd kind of humor hidden in the pre-flood names and durations, though it is very dry. A later human civilization, short-lived, anxious, prone to rebellion and taxes and poor decisions, keeps copying records of ancient rulers who seem to have held office for spans longer than geology should tolerate. The sheer patience of that is almost lovable. Like a bureaucracy so committed to precedent, it will preserve impossible precedent rather than risk losing the shape of the old file. One more detail keeps tugging at the edge of the mind. The pre-flood section does not preserve only duration. It preserves sequence. Sequence is one of the oldest forms of trust in any archive. The order of cities. The order of rulers. The transfer of kingship from one place to another. All of that creates a route through time. Even if the durations have been magnified, ritualized, or encoded in sacred number, the sequence still insists on being handled like logistics. Kingship was in this city, then in that city, then in another. It moved. It was not everywhere at once. That is how administrations behave. They have centers. They relocate. They contract after crisis. They resume where conditions allow. If you were a later scribe copying this material after the flood, centuries had already become tradition. You would feel that movement in your own body. The stylus pauses. The name of the city changes. The seat of kingship shifts. The line continues. There is something almost mournful in that motion, as if the record itself knows the first world could not be kept intact and so must be tracked by transfers instead. The cities remain like stepping stones just visible under deep water. You cannot walk back to them, but you can still count them. By now, the listener should feel something very specific. Not belief forced too quickly. Not disbelief lazily preserved. Something in between. A recognition that the scribes were preserving the memory of a system they themselves thought older, larger, and more authoritative than the ordinary post-flood world around them. Whether that memory was symbolic, historical, or some difficult mixture of both remains open. but the dignity with which it is preserved is not open. The archive treated it as serious. So let the 5 cities stand for a moment in the dim light. Let the names hang there like old bells over water. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. Let the huge rains settle without trying to solve them too quickly. Let the flood remain where the text puts it, a wall across time. Because the next movement of the story needs that wall. Once it stands in place, we can finally look more closely at the labor problem that produced humanity, the council decisions that made destruction thinkable, and the darker possibility that pre-flood administration was not fantasy at all, but memory of a world managed from beyond itself. There is a point in the old Mesopotamian record where the story of heaven stops sounding lofty and starts sounding tired. Not tired in a weak way, but in the way systems get tired when too much weight has been resting on the same beams for too long. The source text we are following tonight reaches that point in Atrahasis, and once it does, the emotional color changes. The gods are not merely shining powers above a distant sky. They are workers under burden. They are administrators facing strain. They are a hierarchy, beginning to crack under the cost of maintaining order. Before humanity enters the stage, the world is already being worked. Canals must be dug, riverbeds managed, boundaries shaped, irrigation held in place against the old temptation of flood and drought. It is a striking beginning because it does not flatter anyone. The cosmos is not introduced as effortless perfection. It is introduced as labor, heavy, repetitive, necessary labor. The lesser divine beings bear that burden for an immense span of time. And then, as the tablets tell it, they reach the edge of willingness. Imagine that scene slowly. Night over the worked land. Heat still trapped in mud brick and earth. Tools abandoned where they fell. The smell of wet soil, reaver silt, sweat, and bitumen. A group gathering in anger that has been fermenting for years too long. Not a riot in the modern, dirty, frantic sense, but something more disciplined and therefore more frightening. They have done their work. They have counted the days. They know what they are owed. And now they are marching toward the house of Enlil. I have always found this one of the most human moments in the whole corpus. The great powers of the ancient world do not begin by creating humanity out of overflowing love. They begin by complaining about workload. There is even a trace of grim humor in it, the kind of humor that slips into a room when a truth is too plain to decorate. Civilizations run on labor. Someone always carries the load. And when the load becomes intolerable, the system changes or breaks. The gods in Atrahasis choose change. They gather in assembly. Anu above, Enlil with command, Enki with his dangerous calm and practical intelligence. The laborers have thrown down their tools. The house of command is surrounded. A solution must be found, and it must be found in a way that restores order without unraveling the structure of the whole system. This is not myth behaving like fog. This is governance behaving like governance. Complaint rises from below. Deliberation hardens above. Then comes policy. Create a substitute. That decision lands with a strange, quiet weight because of how functional it is. Humanity is not asked into the world as a guest. Humanity is manufactured as relief labor. Clay is mixed. Divine substance is added. Form is shaped with intention. The first humans are not dreamers wandering under moonlight with innocent wonder. They are made for task, for maintenance, for service inside an already existing order. That is the chill in the story, and it should be left intact. The old texts are not sentimental about why we are here. If you were standing in that imagined workshop of creation, the scene would feel both sacred and uncomfortably practical. The smell of clay wetted for shaping, hands pressing form from mud, a stillness in the room of concentrated procedure. No dramatic swelling music, no romantic hase. Just the making of a new category of being because the current staffing model is failing. It is almost too modern in its logic, which is one reason it lingers. Some scholars, of course, will tell us this is simply an origin myth explaining toil. That is a fair reading as far as it goes. The story certainly accounts for why humans labor, why temples require service, why the world feels organized around burden. But the source transcript is asking for more than that, and the text itself can bear the pressure. It keeps returning to the same functional mood. Humans are created to do what others no longer wish to do. That is not just symbolism. It is an administrative imagination. The creation itself also feels strangely controlled. In some strands, 7 males and 7 females are formed. In others, the shaping carries the atmosphere of a planned rollout rather than spontaneous birth. Numbers matter. Ratios matter. The making is guided. You can feel that old Mesopotamian preference for ordered deployment even here. Nothing spills into being. It is allocated. And once humanity exists, the burden shifts. The canals are maintained. The fields are worked. The temples receive service. The economy of offering and labor begins to hum. For a while, the system stabilizes. This is the part of the story many later readers overlook because it does not shout. But it matters deeply. Humanity succeeds. Too well. In fact, we are not a failed experiment in these stories. We are a successful one, and success creates its own crisis. The tablets say humanity multiplies. Humanity becomes noisy. Again, the word is easy to underestimate. Noise here is not simply sound. It is population density, crowd pressure, activity, independence, the friction of too much life unfolding under one sky. A field can be quiet. A city cannot. Once humans cluster, store grain, keep animals, hold feasts, sing hymns, argue over boundaries, and raise children inside walls. They begin producing a sort of pressure. The gods above begin to feel it. You know that feeling when a machine works so well it becomes hard to switch off. It gains momentum, habits, self-reinforcing patterns. That seems to be what humanity becomes in Atrahasis. We are made to bear the labor, and we do. But in doing so, we also create growth. That growth becomes difficult for the upper order to tolerate. The burden has not disappeared. It has changed direction. It no longer crushes the divine laborers directly. It rises upward as noise, density, and unmanaged multiplication. Then the assembly turns from creation to regulation. This is one of the darkest and most beautifully restrained moves in the old stories. The gods do not leap immediately to total destruction. They test measures: disease, drought, famine, reduction. One can almost hear the quiet coldness of committee logic in the sequence. Lesser interventions first. Containment if possible. Reset only if necessary. That is what makes the eventual flood decision so terrible. It is not impulsive. It is considered. Enki, as always, complicates the line. He preserves where others narrow. He finds ways around rigid decrees. He protects continuity, sometimes almost slyly. But even his interventions confirm the larger reality. Humanity exists inside a managed framework. It does not own its own conditions. The old archive is relentless on this point. We are not sovereign in origin. We are delegated labor that became too loud. If you were walking through one of the early great cities at this point in the story, perhaps Uruk or some older pre-flood place remembered only through fragments, you would not see a myth. You would see a system at full stretch. Granadiers, work crews, temple obligation, fields under calculation, water under management, children everywhere, animals everywhere, voices, smoke, sex, sickness, repair, markets, exhaustion, the whole humming pressure of civilization. And above it all, in the logic of the text, a set of authorities wondering whether the hum has become too much to preserve in its current form. There is a cruel elegance to that. Humanity is made because labor is needed. Humanity prospers because labor succeeds. Humanity then becomes a problem because prosperity scales. It is almost as if the system cannot bear its own success without imposing a new ceiling. That rhythm will matter later when flood arrives. But even here, it gives the creation story its tragic curve. We were needed. Then we were too much. I think that is why these ancient stories feel both soothing and severe in a sleep-telling. They reduce personal vanity. None of us began as the center of things in this archive. We began as workers under a larger order. There is something calming in that loss of importance. At the same time, it is not a tender loss. It is the calm of being placed into structure, the calm of knowing the system is older than your desires. The source transcript also keeps steering us toward the colony reading here, and this is one of the strongest places to feel its pull. If the gods are speaking in terms of labor, allocation, burden, productivity, overpopulation, and intervention, then Earth begins to sound less like a one-off creation and more like a managed site. A site with staffing issues. A site with output problems. A site whose human population was brought in for function and later had to be regulated. One does not have to accept the boldest literal version of that idea to feel how naturally the text leans toward it. Honestly, the more gently you read Atrahasis, the stranger it becomes. It is not loud mythology. It is calm hierarchy. The clay bodies are shaped. The work begins. The system fills. The upper order frowns. Reduction follows. This is the emotional climate of a managed world. And once you feel it, the title question, what if Earth was only one colony among others, no longer feels like a wild intrusion. It begins to feel like a possible summary, written in modern terms of something the old scribes were already circling in their own way. There is also a recurring softness in the imagery that prevents the story from becoming harsh in the wrong way. Clay, water, reed, mud, breath. The first humans are not forged in steel. They are molded from earth, moist and vulnerable. Even in a tale of labor policy, the material remains intimate. That matters for a sleep story. It lets the dread dissolve into texture. We are hearing about burden and hierarchy. Yes, but through the feel of wet clay, the sound of water channels, the hush of temple rooms, the low fire of work carried out under moonlight. By the end of this movement, humanity should feel newly placed in the listener's mind. Not as accidental, not as self-creating, but as introduced into an already ordered world with a job to do. The gods have shifted from abstract divine beings into a council that manages resources, labor, and thresholds. That is the essential turn. Because once that turn is made, the next step follows naturally. We have to understand the map of that managed world itself. Heaven, earth, Aptu, Kur, the gated underworld, the places above, below, and beyond. All of them functioning less like vague spiritual metaphors and more like distinct jurisdictions inside a larger system of control. If the previous movement gave us the labor logic of creation, this one gives us the map. Because once humanity has been made to serve within an existing order, the next question is simple and almost childlike in the best way. Where exactly is that order? Where are the places the texts keep naming with such confidence? Heaven, earth, Aptu, Kur, the underworld, the distant mountain territories. The old Sumerian universe is not a blur. It is a partitioned world, and its partitions matter. The first sign of that comes in the old stories of Enki and Ninmah, where creation itself feels less like a magical event and more like a workshop process. Enki, lord of the fresh waters below, the keeper of hidden wisdom, the one with dangerous practical intelligence, is already associated with the making of human life through clay, shaping, testing, adjustment. The atmosphere is not one of pure transcendence. It is tactile. Moist clay in the hand. A shaping mind above the clay. A room where bodies are produced toward function. I have always found that story unexpectedly moving. Some of the formed beings are strong. Some are weak. Some are flawed. Some receive unusual destinies. One cannot do this work. Another cannot walk properly. Another is given a role despite limitation. The whole thing reads with a kind of compassionate pragmatism. Humanity is not poured out in perfect identical units. It is differentiated, and the system assigns places accordingly. That is another deeply administrative feeling detail. Even imperfection is absorbed into function. Imagine Enki in that chamber, not as a distant haloed abstraction, but as a being leaning toward the work with the focus of a skilled planner. Cool water nearby from the unseen deep, clay dark under the fingers, the smell of wet earth and lamp smoke, quiet voices, testing, adjusting, the making of humans not as a single miracle flash, but as a sequence of shaped attempts. If you were standing there with me, I think the most striking feeling would be how calm it is. No great apocalypse, just procedure. Creation done like craft. That sense of crafted placement prepares us for the larger geography. In Mesopotamian thought, the world is divided into realms that are distinct enough to govern separately and close enough to interact constantly. An above realm, a human middle realm. The Apsu below, Kur beyond and beneath, with its own gates, judges, and terrible laws. These are not soft metaphors floating around poetry. The texts keep giving them edges. Take the Apsu first. Enki domain, the fresh water deep beneath the earth from which springs, rivers, and life-giving channels rise. In practical Mesopotamian terms, this already makes sense. Because a civilization living between rivers will naturally imagine hidden waters below the ground as the ultimate source behind visible fertility. But the mythic language gives it more than hydrology. The Abzu becomes a place of wisdom, storage, counsel, and protected knowledge. A hidden realm under the visible world, calm, rich, sealed, not chaos, but reserve. If you let the image breathe, it becomes almost dreamlike. Below the mud brick cities and their noise, below the fields and canals and complaints, there is coolness, water in darkness, a chambered depth where knowledge is kept and from which instruction rises. It is one of the most beautiful places in the ancient imagination. Not beautiful in a bright way, but in the way deep wells are beautiful. Quiet, necessary, secret. Then there is Kur. Modern shorthand often calls it the underworld and leaves it there, but that is far too thin. Kur is a territory with boundaries, gates, rulers, messengers, judges, procedures of entry and confinement. In Inanna's Descent, one of the most extraordinary texts to survive from Sumer, the goddess does not drift into death symbolism. She descends through 7 gates. At each gate something is removed. A crown, jewelry, arod, agarmen. Authority stripped step by step. That is not random theater. It is border protocol. You know that feeling when an airport becomes suddenly serious at the final checkpoint, when each layer removes a little more of your assumed ease. The gates of Kur have that mood, only colder, older, and infinitely less forgiving. At the end of that descent sits Ereshkigal, not a vague queen of sadness, but a sovereign, a ruler in her domain. Judges are present. Sentences matter. Inanna is not simply emotionally transformed. She is processed, judged, killed, hung, The underworld in these stories behaves like jurisdiction. That is the key. It has laws that even powerful beings must obey once they cross inside. Exit requires substitution. Release has terms. That is not foggy spirituality. That is legal structure. Let me slow for a moment over those 7 gates, because they deserve it. One gate opens, and a crown is taken. Another opens, and more authority is removed. Then another. A necklace. A rod. A breastplate. A garmen. Each surrender makes the descent more serious. If this were only a morality scene, the objects could have been decorative. They are not. They are insignia. Office made visible. As Inanna goes downward, she is not just undressed. She is disarmed jurisdiction by jurisdiction. By the time she reaches the throne room below, she does not arrive as an equal traveler. She arrives having been stripped of all the signs that gave her force in the upper world. Imagine the sound of that sequence. A clasp loosened. Metal set aside. Cloth pulled away. The little pause before the next gate. The cold intelligence of a system that does not care who you are once you cross into its own lawful dark. It is a magnificent scene because it is not chaos. It is order so severe that even a goddess cannot simply breeze through with a confident smile and expect the doors to grow polite. And once you start seeing Ker that way, the whole Mesopotamian cosmos begins to harden into a map of administrative zones. An above realm under An, and later high sovereign powers. A middle human world shaped by Enlil's authority. The Apsu under Enki, source of hidden knowledge and life waters. Ker is the great lower territory of confinement, judgment, and return barriers. The gods are not simply powers. They are office holders over places. That matters enormously for the larger thesis we are building. Because a colony only makes sense inside a network of jurisdictions. If Earth were merely a symbolic stage, then such territorial precision would be decorative. But if Earth were one managed zone within a broader order, then distinct domain, gateways, assigned rulers, and movement protocols begin to sound less decorative and more foundational. The source transcript also drew attention to how often these domains interact through threshold places. Sacred mountains, gateways, temple centers, deep shrines, routes across impossible distances. This is not a universe of total separation. It is a universe of controlled crossings. That distinction is crucial. The gods come down. Kingship comes down. Inanna goes down. Messages move between cities, between realms, between authorities. The world is partitioned, yes, but connected by channels. The channels are not open to everyone. They are regulated. Think of the temple at Eridu again. Built and rebuilt in layers over the same sacred point. It is not merely a place to flatter Enki. It is a threshold architecture, a local interface with the Abzu. The same can be said, in different ways, of later ziggurats and sacred precincts. They are not just places of gathering. They are places where jurisdiction touches jurisdiction, where what belongs to one domain can be petitioned, interpreted, or transmitted into another. I have always thought that is why the old Mesopotamian world feels so solid, even when its most marvelous claims are being made. It never loses the sense of paperwork, even in the heavens. There is always a gate, a keeper, a seat of rule, a condition, a cost. This is also where Enki and Ninmah casts a longer shadow than people sometimes notice. The differentiated humans in that story are not mistakes thrown away. They are assigned. The world absorbs them by role. The larger cosmos behaves similarly. Realms are differentiated and then administered by fit. Enki below with wisdom and water. Enlil in the middle with decree and command. Inanna moving with terrifying flexibility between zones. Ereshkigal below in the place where return is constrained. The universe has staffing logic. If you were standing on a temple terrace at dusk, this whole map would perhaps feel less abstract than it sounds in modern speech. The sky above, huge and dry. The city below, varm, noisy, and finite. Somewhere under the earth, hidden water feeding the visible world. Somewhere in the dark beyond death, the realm of no return with its own law. A person in such a world would not feel suspended in vague spirituality. He would feel located, very precisely located. And that precision is what the colony reading continues to draw from the archive. Human beings are placed workers in a middle territory. Their rulers receive delegated authority. The gods hold external or superior domains. Movement between those domains is possible, but controlled. Catastrophe can reset one territory without abolishing the whole order. Knowledge can be stored in one domain and transmitted to another. The more one listens, the less this sounds like an accidental pile of myths, and the more it begins to resemble a remembered framework of managed regions. There is something almost comforting in that managed feeling, which may sound odd. A world with gates and jurisdictions is frightening. Yes, but it is also orderly. Nothing drifts without consequence. Nothing happens nowhere. Every movement has a place, and every place has a keeper. Sleep stories can make good use of that kind of dread because it calms by structure. The listener is not lost in chaos. The listener is held inside a map, even if it is a map too large and too old to control. There is one more soft detail that matters here. The lower world is not simply feared. It is administered with ritual regularity, and that means the living must negotiate it through knowledge. Names of gatekeepers matter. Order of descent matters. What is surrendered matters. Even mourning becomes procedural. That is a very Sumerian kind of darkness. Not wild terror, but system. A person listening to these stories in a temple court would not hear only a warning about death. He would hear that every realm, even the coldest one, has structure, and that structure can be known, copied, and passed down. In a universe like that, ignorance is more dangerous than fear. The final movement we need after this is outward. So far we have the assembly, the labor problem, humanity as workforce, and the jurisdictional map of the divine world. The next question is, what happened at the edges? distant lands, mountain cities, resource territories, trade, tribute, movement, and the sense that Sumer was not alone even in worldly terms. That is where Arata, Tilmon, Magan, and the long routes come in, because once the world has been mapped into domains, the archive begins showing goods, message, and authority moving between them. The farther the old Sumerian archive looks from its own river plain, the stranger it becomes. Up to now, we have stayed among councils, clay, flood boundaries, and the managed map of heaven, earth, Aptu, and Kua. But a system is not proven only by its center. A system reveals itself most clearly at the edges, where distance has to be crossed. Messages have to survive mountains, and authority has to keep its shape far from home. That is where the old names Arata, Tilmon, Mahagan, and Melaha begin to glow faintly in the dark. Arata comes first in the imagination because it carries the right mixture of beauty and resistance. In the old poems of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, this distant land is not described as a vague paradise or a decorative foreign place invented to flatter Uruk. It is a real pressure point. It has resources. It has rulers. It stands across multiple mountain ranges. It can refuse demand. It can negotiate. It can delay. That is not dream geography. That is the feel of an outer station in a larger network. Imagine the road to Arata in slow detail. The air thins as the ground rises. Dust changes flavor. The easy mud of the southern plain gives way to gravel, then sharper stone, then cold passes where the wind cuts across the face and carries no kindness in it. A herald moves through this world with a message too important to trust to memory's softness. His sandals grind on broken paths. His mouth dries. His cloak stirs against his legs. Behind him lie temple courtyards and measured canals. Before him lie blue stone, metal, mountain distance, and a ruler who does not answer immediately. I have always loved the physical exhaustion in those old mountain routes. It keeps the story honest. No one drifts into Arata through a pleasant symbolic haze. You get there by crossing dangerous space. That is how resource frontiers behave. They resist easy possession. And what does Arata have? Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, precious materials, the gleam and weight of extraction. The sort of goods a sacred and administrative center wants badly enough to send repeated demands. Enmerkar wants submission. He wants tribute. He wants acknowledgement of superior authority centered in Uruk and sanctified through Inanna. Arata hesitatis, resists, bargains. The result is not simply a heroic myth. It feels like diplomatic correspondence stretched into epic shape. There is a reason the source transcript leans so hard on this material. Once you allow Arata to behave like a resource territory rather than a fairy hill, the whole colony reading strengthens. Sumer begins to look less like a lone miraculous cradle and more like one command center in a wider zone of controlled or contested dependencies. The farther places are not imaginary because the center requires drama. They are economically necessary because the center requires inputs. You know that feeling when a map on a wall stops looking decorative and starts looking hungry. That is the feeling of Arata in these stories. Uruk looks outward and sees not mystery but supply. And then there is the extraordinary little hinge in the story, the invention of writing. The messenger cannot carry the full complexity of Enmerkar's demand by speech alone, so words are pressed into clay. A message too intricate, too exact, too politically loaded is given a durable body. It is one of the most famous scenes in the literature for good reason. And the reason is not only that writing begins, it is that writing begins because administration has outgrown memory. Complexity requires inscription. That is a very particular origin. If you were in that room, perhaps the clay is still cool from preparation. The stylus is lifted. Someone pauses, not because they are inventing art, but because speech has become too fragile for the task at hand. Then the marks begin. A message leaves the lungs and enters matter. Diplomacy hardens. Distance becomes survivable. The system gains a longer arm. Honestly, there is something almost moving about that. Writing, one of humanity's great glories, arriving because someone, somewhere, needed a foreign ruler to stop pretending he had misunderstood the instructions. This is where the story widens further. Arata is not alone. Dilmun appears. Megan appears. Meluha appears. Their exact historical correspondences remain debated in places. And caution is right. We cannot turn every old name into a neat, modern pin on a map without risk. Some scholars argue these names shifted across time, or gathered multiple reference, or combined real trade memory with literary idealization. We cannot be sure of every border, but uncertainty at the edge does not erase the pattern. The pattern is distance linked by flow. Dilmun, often imagined as bright, pure, and liminal, also functions in practical terms as a node. Megan carries the smell of copper and sea root labor. Meluha glimmers at the far horizon of exchange, a place from which valued materials, and perhaps even peoples, moved into Mesopotamian awareness. The archive keeps naming outer places because the center depends on them. That dependence is one of the oldest honest things a civilization can record. If you stand quietly in a Mesopotamian port scene in your imagination, the whole network becomes tangible. Boats bumping against moorings, rope under strain, bitumen and vet wood, cargo brought in under watchful eyes, stone that did not come from the plain, metal that had to travel, timber from elsewhere, shell, bead, pigment, raw material. A scribe nearby tracking quantities because prestige without accounting is just expensive confusion. The river breathes. Men shout softly. Somebody lies about a shipment. Somebody else writes the real figure down. Civilization expands by receipt. That practical breath matters because it keeps the Anunnaki question tethered to something worldly. If the divine order described in the texts is real in any historical or encoded sense, it would not remain trapped in sky language alone. It would extend into roots, extraction, tribute, allocation, logistics. That is exactly what the archive shows. Far lands and local temples are not separate conversations. They belong to the same nervous system. The role of Inanna in these outer relations makes this even more interesting. She is not merely the goddess of ecstatic feeling or battle frenzy in these stories. She is tied to prestige, legitimacy, and the movement of authority between centers. In the errata material, her favor matters. Where she stands matters. Which city carries her weight matters. This is not unlike later imperial politics, where a center does not dominate only through force or grain, but through symbolic authority that makes distant compliance feel cosmically proper. Imagine an emissary pausing at dusk before entering a foreign court. The clay message tucked safely away. Dust on the hem. Lapis and metal somewhere beyond the walls. The question in the room unspoken but sharp. Who truly holds sanction? Uruk with its temple weight, or Arata with its mountain wealth? Inanna's name hangs over the room like perfume mixed with steel. That is not vague religion. It is geopolitics with incense. I think that is why these stories wear so well in the dark. They understand that power is never only practical and never only sacred. It is always both. Grain and God. Root and ritual. Cargo and crown. The old archive keeps braiding them until the distinction feels artificial. There is also a subtle emotional effect in how the distant places are described. They are not simply exotic. They are threshold places, difficult to reach, rich in what the center lacks, often associated with mountains, sea crossings, or liminal brightness. Such places feel less like neighboring villages and more like outer rooms in a larger house. That feeling feeds the colony idea without forcing it crudely. Earth, or at least the humanly managed zone of Sumer, begins to seem like one room among others. Not necessarily the highest room, not necessarily the oldest. Just one important room linked by traffic, demand, and order. By this point, the listener should also notice how often messages and materials move while authority attempts to move more slowly. That is the texture of networks everywhere. Goods outrun law. Messages test loyalty. Routes generate new pressures. Centers want compliance from edges. Edges use distance as leverage. The Sumerian and Akkadian materials may wrap all this in older language, but the pulse is familiar. A colony system, if such a system is what we are hearing, would sound exactly like this at the level of lived experience. One more image is worth lingering over. A storeroom in a temple city. Cool inside compared with the outer heat. Shelves or stacked goods arranged with more care than any visitor might expect. Lapis lazuli catching a little light. Hammered metal with a dull glow. Seals. Ropes. Yar stoppers. A scribe unrolling a mental map of where all of this came from. Not local field. Not local kiln. Elsewhere. Across water, mountain, and distance. The temple is not only a sacred place, it is the place where the outer world becomes countable. That is one of the great recurring motifs of this whole script. The museum hush turned backward through time into temple hush. The same silence around stored objects. The same trust that what is being kept matters beyond immediate use. The same sense that archives and storerooms preserve more than material. They preserve shape. And shape is what the story is now almost ready to name. Not myth piled on myth. Not random wonder, but shape. A center receiving authority from above. A labor force installed below. Multiple jurisdictions around it. Outer territories feeding resources inward. Messages hardened into writing to survive distance. Flood as reset. Kingship descending again. The map is nearly complete. One last softness belongs here, too. The farther zones in the texts are never treated as pure emptiness. They are named because someone had to remember them. Memory itself becomes part of the network. A place beyond 7 ridges only matters to a clay archive if messages keep reaching it. And if goods, authority, or danger keep flowing back. That is why the old names linger with such weight. They are not decorative horizon paint. They are filed edges of the known system. By the time the herald returns from Arada, or the cargo comes in from Megan, or the priests of a river city invoke Dilmun with that half-bright, half-distant tone, the listener can feel the world stretching without dissolving. The center remains the center. Yes, but the center survives only because its outer rooms do not vanish from record. The last step is not to become louder. The last step is to become clearer. We have to return to the deeper infrastructure of the whole system. The tablets of destiny. The me. The star paths. The repeating frameworks that make the network coherent. Only then can the story end where it should. Not with a cheap shout of proof, but with that colder and more beautiful conclusion the archive has been whispering from the beginning. Earth may not have been imagined as the only world that mattered. It may have been one administered domain among several, and the clay kept the memory because forgetting it would have made the whole system harder to read. At the end of a long, old story, there is always a temptation to force a verdict. To gather every strange line, every archive whisper, every impossible number, and strike the table with a final answer. I do not think the Mesopotamian record likes that kind of ending. It prefers something sterner and more patient. It prefers pattern, and the pattern by now is difficult to ignore. We began with the well-Blundell prism and a sentence that sounded too calm to be harmless. Kingship descended from heaven. We followed the wedges back through translation, through councils, through labor revolts among the gods, through the creation of humanity as managed workforce, through the partitioned realms of heaven, earth, Aptu, and Kua, through mountain corridors to Arata, and through distant names that mark the outer edges of a trade and authority network wider than the southern river plain. Now the final task is to ask, what holds all those pieces together? The old answer lies in things like the me and the tablets of destiny. These are among the most quietly radical ideas in the whole archive. They sound mythic at first, as they should. Divine decrees. Fate tablets. Powers carried or stolen. But the longer you sit beside them, the less airy they seem. The me behave like packages of operational capacity. Kingship, craft, judgment, music, writing, destruction, order. Things a civilization needs if it is going to function at all. They can be stored, transferred, lost, contested. That is not how one imagines abstract virtues. That is how one imagines infrastructure. I have always found the theft scenes especially revealing. When order can be destabilized because something authoritative has been taken, you are no longer in the soft realm of moral allegory. You are in system vulnerability. Remove the right object, or the right body of knowledge, and the whole arrangement shudders. Again, that feels embarrassingly modern. Ancient clay tablets are out here describing governance like a badly secured server room. And then there are the tablets of destiny. Their exact contours shift across the traditions, but the central feeling remains constant. Whoever controls them holds legitimate order, binding decree, the right to structure outcomes. Lose them, and governance falters. Recover them, and reality can be restabilized. One can translate all that upward into theology, of course, but one can also let the colder functional meaning remain. These are control instruments, authorization devices, the things that make a hierarchy operative rather than decorative. If you imagine such an object in a temple archive, the atmosphere becomes wonderfully still. No glowing magic, no gaudy light, just something small enough to hold and large enough to govern, hidden in a chamber, too cool and quiet for ordinary traffic. A keeper nearby, a line of authority running out from it invisibly into cities, routes, calendars, and decisions. That is how the archive wants power to feel. Concentrated and transferable. The same infrastructural mood returns in the stars. Mul. A pin and the broader astronomical corpus divide the heavens into paths. A sine celestial position, and render the sky as a field of ordered movement. I do not think it is an accident that the same civilization that imagines transferable decrees also imagines the heavens as charted territory. The stars are not merely admired. They are organized. Their order can be read, copied, taught, and used. This is the logic of a system that believes reality itself has been administratively arranged. You know that feeling when a story stops being a story and starts feeling like a manual written in ceremonial language. That is what the Mesopotamian archive does in its best moments. It keeps one foot in reverence and the other in procedure. That double footing is why it still troubles us. A pure myth can be placed on a shelf. A myth that behaves like documentation keeps walking around the room at night. By now, the 3 readings the source transcript offered stand very clearly before us. Reading 1. Pure mythology. The Anunnaki are gods in the conventional, ancient sense. Personified powers invented to explain social order, environmental strain, and the mystery of the sky. Reading 2. Encoded wisdom. The stories preserve philosophical insight and cultural memory, but not literal records of external rulers or colonies. Reading 3. Historical documentation and theological clothing. The texts preserve memory of real hierarchy, real transfer of knowledge, real external authority, and real multi-domain administration, described in the only vocabulary the scribes possessed. Mainstream scholarship prefers the first reading, sometimes allows the second, and keeps the third at arm's length. That caution is understandable. The third reading can attract loud people who rush in long before the evidence has had time to breathe. Still, caution should not harden into refusal. What makes the third reading difficult to dismiss is not one dramatic line. It is the cumulative discipline of the archive, the consistency of hierarchy, the procedural flavor of councils, the repeat appearance of managed domains, the transfer of kingship, the resource routes, the preserved astronomical precision, the administrative dignity of even the strangest records. Honestly, if this were all random fantasy, it would be much messier. Instead, the clay keeps presenting the same world from multiple angles. Earth is governed, not central by default. Humanity is installed, not self-originating. Knowledge is transmitted, not proudly invented from zero. Catastrophe resets systems, but higher authority remains. Distant territories feed centers. Gateways matter. Offices matter. Roots matter. That is enough, I think, to grant the strong question its full dignity. What if the Sumerians were preserving memory of Earth as one administered domain among several? Not proof. Dignity. There is a difference, and I would rather keep the difference clean. If you were standing beside me now in the last part of the night, I would probably lower my voice rather than raise it. The temptation with material like this is always to become grand. But the archive itself is rarely grand in that cheap, modern way. It is exact, calm, sometimes almost rude in its refusal to explain itself more than once. So the ending should match the archive. Quiet, exact, and a little impossible. Return to the prism, the same object with which we began. Cool vault air, the dark little weight of fired clay resting in a drawer. The first line waiting in silence until someone opens the tray again. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu. That sentence now carries more with it than it did at the start. It carries the labor revolt. The clay made humans. The flood boundary, the 7 gates, the mountain roots, the cargo of lapis and metal, the hidden fresh waters, the star paths, the stolen decrees, the councils above and the records below. The line has become dense. That density is the real gift of the story. Not certainty, but pressure. Pressure against the modern habit of treating the oldest written civilization on Earth as if it were too primitive to describe its own understanding of power in meaningful terms. The Sumerians may have been wrong about many things. Of course they were. So are we. But they were not careless. Their archive is not careless. It keeps asking to be read as though its authors meant what they said. And what did they say? In the end, they said that authority came down. They said humans were taught. They said realms were assigned. They said distant territories mattered. They said the flood reset a system rather than inventing one. They said the sky was ordered. They said civilization did not begin in self-congratulation. It began under inheritance. There is something oddly restful about that. Once the first chill passes, to be inherited rather than self-made. To belong to a structure older than your own little era. To be one late listener among many late listeners. overhearing a conversation already ancient when Babylon was young. Sleep stories do well with that kind of scale. It empties the room of clutter. It gives the mind something vast enough to rest against. The final image should not be a spaceship, or a glowing gate, or some noisy, modern intrusion. It should be much older and quieter. A scribe in dim light, the edge of his tablet damp enough to receive one more line. A city outside breathing through reed mats and low walls. Somewhere beyond it, other territories, other stations, other centers of rule, perhaps half remembered and half hidden behind sacred language. Above all of it, a sky the texts insist was not empty, but governed. And in the hand of the scribe, the stubborn decision to preserve rather than simplify. That decision is why we are here at all. Without that fidelity, without those generations of copyists who declined to trim the impossible numbers, who declined to erase the descent from heaven, who declined to clean the stories into safer moral tales, we would have far less trouble on our hands tonight. The archive would be tidier. The world would be smaller. And perhaps sleep would come faster. But the clay survived. And because it survived, the larger question survived with it. Was Earth the only humanly relevant world in the Mesopotamian imagination? Clearly not. Was it one territory within a wider administered order? The texts keep leaning that way. Were the Anunnaki only symbols? Perhaps. Were they remembered rulers, teachers, and managers translated into divine language by later copyists? Perhaps. The archive does not force the final choice. It only keeps the possibilities open with a discipline too sharp to ignore. So let the answer remain where the best old mysteries leave it, suspended, but not empty. The Sumerian record may be mythology, encoded memory, or historical testimony wearing sacred clothing. Whatever it is, it refuses to let Earth remain simple. It places our world inside a larger field of jurisdictions, paths, and authorities. It tells us that civilization arrived under order already in motion, and it preserves that claim with all the patient seriousness of clay. The fire is lower now. The room is smaller. The prism rests again in darkness. Outside, your own world continues with its lights and roads and little concerns. But somewhere beneath those concerns, the old pattern lingers. Centers and edges, labor and burden, gates and domains, messages carried across distance, archives preserving what later minds no longer know how to classify. The oldest written voices on Earth have not proved everything. They have done something better. They have made the comfortable story much harder to tell. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Let the question stay open. Let it breathe. Let Eridu stand in the dark marshland, waiting for the first descent. Let the floodline remain where the old list drew it. Let the far mountains hold errata in silence. Let the Abzu remain cool beneath the world. Let the stars keep their paths. And let the clay continue to whisper, in its dry administrative way, that human history may have begun not with isolation, but with inheritance. Good night.